But anytime you have questions, if you have a microphone, feel free to ask those questions. I'd ask that you keep your microphone muted until then, though, just so there's no background noise. Or you can always type a comment in the chat bubble down on the right-hand side of the screen. You see that little icon of the bubble there. And feel free to ask any questions that you have, and I'll be glad to stop and answer them. A couple of things about this assignment overall. First of all, I see it almost as the final exam. If you notice, I give some reading check quizzes and that kind of thing throughout the semester, but I really don't test this class, English 1101, because I feel like the writing itself is your test. You know, how well you're able to incorporate the concepts as we go through the semester, whether it be about description or diction. You know, that will show up, your understanding will show up in your actual writing, your formal writing. And so so I don't actually give tests per se in this class. And this particular paper, this research paper, is like the final exam for the class, because what it really shows me is everything you have learned this semester, from how to write a good introduction, how to stick with a thesis, how to include description, how to do research and document information, how to provide good transitions, how to elevate the level of diction to that mid-level, you know, where it's not too formal and it's not too conversational. So please understand, that's the reason that the paper is weighted as heavily as it is. Now, I realize we've only got 2 weeks left in class. The last day of class is July 27th. And that's the day that this paper is due. You'll have no other assignments, of course, at that point. I realize that's not a lot of time. And so what I have done is I have eliminated one of the kind of building block assignments that students in a regular 15-week term do associated with this paper, called the annotated bibliography, simply because you just don't have time. It would just be trying to kind of pile on a little bit too much work. So even though I think that assignment is really helpful to students as they do their research, that's not required. And if you haven't watched yet the video that I included in the weeks 9 and 10 folder that has to do with conducting research, it's very important that you do it, that you watch that video. It's recorded. I recorded it in the past. I normally, in the past, when I had this live lecture going over the requirements for this assignment, that was the second half of the lecture. But I felt like we were covering so much information that I actually have now divided it up, and so I just provide that video for you. But it does walk you through, you know, how to use the databases, and, you know, in a little bit more detail. What about Google Scholar? Answers questions about Wikipedia, addresses field research, and so forth. So please be sure and watch that video. The only thing about it is that I taped it during a full 15-week semester, so it does reference the annotated bibliography several times. Just be aware you are not assigned that particular bibliography. Second thing I want you to know is that your issue proposals, I have read them. They should be available. You should be able to read the very top little comment. If you return to the issue proposal, turn it in Dropbox, the very top blue comments whether or not your proposals approved. I think almost all of them are. The only exceptions, it's not that I disapproved any, but that I recommended that you either narrow down or that you be a bit more specific in your scope, because this paper, even though it's about double the length of previous papers, it's still pretty short, especially for a research paper. So you want to make sure that you're focused enough so that you can adequately argue from a particular perspective. Now, another thing that's important, and by the way, if you did not turn in an issue proposal, please be aware I have to approve your topic before you begin, and there are a lot of reasons for that. One of them is you can't just turn in a final paper on this one. I've got to see a draft. I want to see your process. So if you did not turn in an issue proposal, you can still upload one. There'll be a small penalty for it being late, but you do need to look back at that assignment and have your proposal approved before you continue. And then finally, we want to talk a little bit now about argumentation itself, and then we're going to get into some specifics about the assignment and answer your questions. I don't want to keep you any longer than is necessary, and I realize some of this information is covering perhaps things that you've either read or kind of viewed in the past, but I'm going to add some additional comments. Argumentation is a form of persuasion, and it's a particularly structured form. It's not the same thing as expressing your opinion and finding some research to support your opinion. Please understand that, okay? Often we tend to think of more purely persuasive papers as being more emotionally based, and you want to make sure that when you're talking about argumentation, argumentation dates all the way back to Aristotle and the Greeks, and because essentially their form of government was based on people informing themselves, and the way they informed themselves were speakers stood around the square and discussed different topics, and in order to try and persuade people to agree with them and vote their particular vote their particular way. And so primarily argumentation is based on, it's fact-based. It's based more on the head, or what we call logos, than it is on the heart, which would be pathos, which is trying to persuade people, emotionally. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. So argument is comprised of assertions designed to convince readers to accept an idea, to adopt a solution, or to change their opinion. Notice that the goal, again, is not to express, you the writer, it's not to express your opinion. That's not the point. The point is to try and get people to agree with you. And that's trickier. That's harder to do. It's one thing if your audience is a group of people who already agree with you, right? In that case, you don't have a lot of persuading to do. And so the types of information that you include can differ somewhat from if you've got an audience that's either that's neutral or even perhaps hostile to your particular point of view. So if the goal is to get people to either, to change their minds, or at least to pay attention to what you're saying, to consider it, or to take some kind of action, you've got to approach it differently. And that's the reason argumentation is based largely more on facts and statistics and expert testimony and eyewitness testimony and reasons and that kind of thing. It's a more logical approach to trying to convince people versus using other methods. And in argumentation, we use the word claim, which is the same thing as the thesis. It's the main point about the topic that you want to argue. Now, according to Aristotle, again, this goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks. There are three, so that's the reason we call it classical information. It's classical because it dates back. But there are three main ways of developing an argument. Through logos, which is the appeal to reason, or we're going to say your head. Pathos, which is appeal to emotions, your heart. And then ethos, which is appeal to your value system or your conscience, or in some cases, religious appeal. Now, again, logos should be the majority of types of information that you try and find to support your argument. And these are just some examples of types of logos. So logos, again, is appeal to reason. If you think about, the whole idea, if you're in a court of law and you've got two lawyers who are arguing a point on either side, and there's a scale there, what they're trying to do is to weigh down their side of the scale through evidence, through statistics, through facts, through documents. So it's not based on opinion. Okay, logos is never based on opinion unless the person happens to be an expert, and that's the exception. Now, granted, you can have biased experts, of course, right? That can happen, but for the most part, what you're trying to do is weigh down your side of an issue. If you think of that scale, by providing lots of good information for people to consider as they think about your perspective. Okay, so it emphasizes critical thinking, it emphasizes reasoned arguments, it emphasizes evidence. The advantages of logos is that it does actually provide evidence. It's fact-based. You can go and verify. All right, so that's part of the advantage of logos. Part of the disadvantages is that your readers have to be willing to verify. All right. Sometimes it demands specialized knowledge, and readers have to be paying attention. And one of the things, or in this case readers, but audiences, one of the things we know about audiences is they increasingly have a shorter and shorter attention span. Hence, news and so forth has gotten briefer and briefer, and they tend to, be easily pulled into kind of fantastic headlines and a lot of imagery and often, especially, pathos or emotional appeals. Pathos is appeals to emotion, and usually it has to do with either desire or fear. And this is one way that people try and persuade other people to do something. So pathos, these are the types of things that we either desire or are worried about. Self-expression, money, fame, recognition, independence, uniqueness, conformity, friendship, to be in, and then different types of fears, popularity, acceptance, and so forth. And so essentially pathos, and I'll give you an example of pathos. For example, I don't know if you've seen that commercial on television. I don't know that they play it anymore, but it was done by, I think, one of the animal rights organizations, and it showed these sort of suffering animals in cages, and there was this song in the background, Sarah McLachlan singing In the Arms of the Angels, and it just showed these animals that have been abused, and that's pathos, because the goal of that particular advertisement was to get people to send money because they felt so sorry for these animals, right? But the thing is about pathos is that it can backfire on you. The advantage is it can be very powerful. If you get people scared enough, they'll take action without even thinking about it, right? Or if you get people wanting something badly enough, a lot of times they don't think through. So it's easy pathos can be absolutely legitimate. For example, think about some of the advertisements for, there's a billboard that's close to one of my exits that shows I think the guy's parents put it up. It was a teenager who was killed while texting and driving. That's a fact. It's fact-based, so there's logos there, but it's mainly pathos, because essentially it's an appeal to our emotions, like take care of yourselves and people that you love, because this can happen to you if you're driving and you're texting. So that can be very powerful and very legitimate, but it also can be manipulative, and that's part of the disadvantage of pathos, of appealing to people's emotions. It can be short-lived. It can easily backfire. For example, I'll never watch that commercial. I flip off. It's not that I don't want to know. It's just that I've seen it once and I don't need to see it again. And it often can provide very limited factual support for whatever it is whatever the image is. Ethos is the third type of appeal that can be used in argumentation. And ethos has to do with ethics. It's got the same root as the word ethics, okay? And so it supports an argument by using shared values. Now, here's the important part. Shared. It only works if you find common ground with your audience, okay? If you are an agnostic person religiously and you're trying to appeal to someone who's highly religious, unless you find some common ground there, you are not going to have an open audience. They're just not going to listen to what you say, if that makes sense. If you are highly patriotic and you write a paper that's solely based on patriotism and your audience doesn't also share that value system, then you're not going to effectively write a good argument, okay? Because it may be legitimate, but if the whole goal again of argumentation is to get either people to pay attention, to listen, to take some action, or to agree with you, to change their minds, you've got to find common ground, and that's not always easy to do, especially, I'm sure, as you know, in our current culture. Now, ethos reflects deeply held convictions rather than personal motivations. And there are 4 different types of ethos. Religion being one that we think about. If you tend to be on the same page with somebody religiously, it's easy to make arguments that they'll agree with. It's not so much true if you're not on the same page, and you have to find common ground if that's possible. The same thing with patriotism. Humanitarianism is sort of a belief in the higher good of humans, but it's outside of the religious realm, basically. There is some overlap there, but it's not it doesn't have a religious underpinning. And then finally, standards. Every group has standards. You know, as an instructor, we are held to a certain standard. As a matter of fact, if you're a K through 12 teacher, you're often held to a higher standard than the general public because of the impact that you can have on kids. For example, I had to sign, when I taught in high school, I had to sign what was called a moral turpitude clause, which basically said in public, I will conduct myself this way, and this way because of the influence that I can have on kids. So there are certain standards that are applied if you work somewhere. Where you work probably has standards. It just depends on what the value system is. So their standards, maybe they want their employees to show up on time, they want them to be dressed a certain way, or, you know, often you can tell the kind of the ethos of a place, their value system based on the standards that they hold. So different groups share different standards. Again, ethos can be a difficult thing to build a paper on simply because you can't assume that your audience necessarily agrees with you. And since primarily I'm your audience for this paper, I try to be as neutral as possible. If I do my job well, you'll never know what my religious persuasion is. You'll never know my politics. You'll never know, because that's not my job. My job is to help you to improve your writing. So I kind of represent a generic audience. So you can't assume I'm going to be, automatically sympathetic, either truly or even, just for the purposes of this assignment on your side about something. So you've got to approach it more from, that's the reason, emphasize logical appeals, emphasize reason, emphasize facts. That works. Okay. So again, the advantage of ethos is that it can be a very powerful motivator, but the disadvantage is that it only works, again, if there is, if you share a writer's value system. Now that's a little bit of a framework for where we're headed as we try and point you some directions for finding good sources for your paper. That's the reason there's such an emphasis on using good information. I do point you toward the databases, but a student sent me an email earlier today asking, do we only have to use the GNTC databases? And the answer is no. I'm not limiting you to that, but I will tell you that the least successful papers are the ones that just try and do a Google search. Those almost always end up, because the students often, they think that's faster, and they often don't take the time to evaluate their sources. And so they end up using things that are questionable. I hope by now we've built enough of a foundation so that you understand how to do evaluations. If you are going to use Google or Bing or Safari, those sort of popular search engines, for some of your research. Certainly don't use it for all of your research. Again, watch that video that's in this week's folder. But I hope by now we've built a strong enough foundation so that you understand how to go about using and finding and using the best information available to you. I'm going to pause there and see if you have any questions about argumentation in general, and if not, we're going to go on to the assignment itself. Okay, I'm going to assume no. So, as I've said before, if we were in a face-to-face class, I would distribute the guidelines, have students read them silently to themselves, and then I would go over them with the students, adding some additional information. So that's what I'm going to do now, and then we're going to wrap up. This will not take, again, I've divided this lecture into one recorded video that goes over the actual research process and finding information and field research and all that. And then this part is just to try and give you enough of a setup to answer your questions and get you started. Okay. Again, this paper is worth more than any other of your assignments this semester simply because it asks more of you. It's longer. You've got, not as much time as you would have had ordinarily in a 15-week course, but you've got a little bit longer to work on it. To work on the first draft. The first draft is not due until a week from this Thursday. The length of course is roughly double, a little bit longer or a little bit shorter is fine. And by a little bit longer, I mean a little shorter, let's say down to 1,100 words, okay? A little bit longer, we can maybe fudge up to 1,750. So again, if you remember that little target thing that I drew before, this is the bullseye right here. But a little bit, you know, the next level out, that's okay as well. A lot shorter or a lot longer, if it's a lot shorter, it means you haven't done enough research, or else your topic's too narrow. If it's a lot longer, it means you're not controlling your research, or your topic is too broad. Okay, so so this is what we're aiming for here. The topic itself, take a side on a clearly debatable issue, which means that there's more than one opinion about the issue. And of course, you've already submitted an issue proposal, I hope. And again, if you haven't, please do so immediately. That explores your intentions. It must be approved. And again, I think I approved everybody's. If I remember correctly, I did recommend some of you, though, to kind of think through and maybe narrow a bit more, be a little bit more specific. As always, I always recommend students, and especially with this assignment, have a backup topic in mind, okay? Because often what we, in research, we think that we know what we want to find. We think we know what we want to do. This is how you feel about it. This is where you want to go. And then you have trouble finding information. That frequently happens. And especially because we're running out of time, my recommendation to you is if you are having trouble finding sources, immediately change topics, okay? Now, you don't necessarily need to write a whole nother issue proposal for me, but do contact me if you are going to need to change topics, and let me help you kind of get started with the new one, okay? Now, notice that your topic does not necessarily have to be controversial. Just because something's debatable, which means different people disagree about it, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's controversial, which often we tend to think of as being a bit more emotionally loaded. Nor does it have to be about some broad political or social issue. I've had people argue, let's see, I had a student argue about bullying. She actually presented her paper to one of the local school systems, saying that at the elementary school level they weren't doing enough about bullying, because I think her daughter had been bullied or whatever. So she did research, and she actually found at the national level there had been some programs instituted that really did seem to help control bullying in younger kids. And so that was kind of what she argued. So, you know, there are just a variety of ways to approach this. These topics are off limits primarily not because they're not great topics. They are, and certainly they're debatable, and many of them are controversial. But quite frankly, I've been teaching research writing for 30-something years, and I'm tired of reading about them. So it's not that there's not even anything new. There is, for several of these, there are a lot of new things happening right now at the state and federal level that actually updates these somewhat. I've often for years, these were the first things that a lot of students thought about, and I just don't want to read those papers anymore. So also, of course, please do not do research you did in another class. Don't recycle old papers, that kind of thing. I hope you know that. There is a note on your syllabus that actually says all work for this course should be original this semester. You must use 4 to 8 sources. It's fine with me if you use more than 8. This question always comes up. It's fine to use more than 8. However much it takes to get the job done, do it, okay? And we're going to circle back, by the way, to topics in just a second. But I want to get through this part of it. So you can use more than 8, and one of those sources may be field research. Again, the video in this week's lesson explains how to do field research, and if you the 3 different types and how to kind of set those up. If you actually end up using some field research and want to know how to document them, just email me and I'll let you know. format, same format we've used all semester. You don't need a title page or anything like that. At this point, I'm going to tell you it is counting off if you on the grade if you are not for a it's a 5-point deduction if you do not follow the format with the header in the upper left-hand corner. If you're not double spacing, if you're not indenting. I mean, because I've gone through this. We've gone through this together all semester, okay, with the title that's centered and so forth. So please just be sure and follow the same format we've used throughout the semester, okay? And of course, you do need a title that's relevant to the subject matter. Please don't use a title page. We're just using the same MLA. The page form, the way the page looks is actually based on Modern Language Association formatting. I know that can get confusing. We're using APA formatting for your actual documentation, but page design is MLA. So we've just reviewed all of this. Please have a clear claim, which is your controlling idea. And it's mainly should be supported with logic. All right, with reasons, with facts, with eyewitness expert testimony, eyewitness testimony, statistics, and so forth, okay? That should be the bulk of your material. When you're researching, that's what you're looking for. You can also use some emotional, and there is some overlap, by the way. I used that example before about the billboard, you know, that was both logical, it was fact-based, it did happen, but also it had an emotional appeal, and the emotional appeal was the powerful part. A lot of examples are emotional appeals, you know, they appeal to our emotions. And if you can find common ground, you can certainly use ethical appeals. Again, went over all this a few minutes ago. There is a section, a document in your book that talks about deductively arranging your information versus inductively. We don't have time to go into a thorough lesson about how to do this. So just here's the main difference between the two. And how to decide whether to arrange your information deductively or inductively. Deductively is when it's kind of how we've been writing all semester. The introduction contains your thesis, or in this case, we're using the word claim. So you tell the reader what you're going to argue, you argue it, and then you tell the reader what you argued, right? So it's more of what I would call an in-your-face type approach. And with both of these methods, you want to lead with your strongest stuff. Inductively actually builds a case first before, and so it actually ends with questions. So your introduction would end with questions, much as you did with your issue proposal. And I have had students ask me, can I use sections of my issue proposal in my paper? And absolutely, if it fits, you know, sure, lift it and you know, move it into your to your paper itself. So inductively, your introduction ends with questions. It suggests a direction, then it builds a case, and then what happens at the end of the paper, the claim actually comes in the conclusion. It's what we call an inductive leap. And normally the way you decide which of these two methods is the best to use with your subject often has to do with how controversial your subject is. If you've chosen something that is inflammatory or that often the disagreement is so strong, then to avoid essentially, because remember, again, the goal of argumentation is not to express your opinion. The goal is to build a case where people will maybe change their minds, maybe take some action, maybe agree with you. And so without kind of immediately putting them off, so the way, you know, inductively is actually a more subtle way of building that argument, where you build the case first, and then you have that inductive leap in the conclusion, and that's where your claim goes, okay? There is a document in the paper, in the weeks 9 and 10 folder that actually discuss this. Again, I'm your intended audience, so again, I just consider me sort of a neutral audience, and which means that I don't automatically agree with you. So that, nor am I automatically opposed to what you're arguing. It simply means you've got to build a case, okay? And then finally, you know, we've studied diction, so please be careful. This, you know, all these things, again, this is like a final exam to me. So everything that we've covered, it does count off at this point in the paper. And in other papers, I've just kind of marked if you had a lot of contractions or something like that. In this paper, it will count. So you need to make sure that you're showing me what you've learned this semester. Evaluating your sources, of course, use reliable, applicable information. Remember that the hardest way to do this is actually using a popular search engine, because of the burden is on you, the researcher and the writer, to make sure you're using credible sources. And again, the papers that honestly have made the lowest grades on this assignment almost always are people who totally used Google exclusively and didn't stop to evaluate the source material. So the video in the folder will walk you through how to use the databases. I do want to add a comment here. Our library is in the process of essentially moving away from Galileo, and so a lot of the information, and they're changing. It almost feels like semester to semester. So I'm having trouble often keeping up with how things look, or what we're going to call the interface. You know, when you actually go to that page, I'm having trouble keeping up with what they've changed at this point and what they haven't. So, for example, I noticed in Galileo you couldn't find academic search complete. That's not listed. Matter of fact, they've changed the way that you access the databases, and so because really I think the goal of the head librarian was to move everybody toward using Primo, not only to find books but also to find articles and so forth. And so the video that I included may have some information that doesn't look the same way anymore, but it definitely covers how to use Primo and how, you know, within the sources to find the citation tools and that kind of thing, as well as field research, as well as Google Scholar, as well as the very limited times where Wikipedia is useful. You should never, ever, ever use Wikipedia in an academic paper, but it's a good place to find search terms, and also if it's a reliable section at the end, there's a bibliography where you could find more reliable sources. So anyway, I'll walk through all of that in that video. Your APA documentation has to be correct on this paper. Now, the good news is, of course, you're going to submit a draft, and I will look over both your in-text citations as well as your references and make sure that everything is wonderful as long as you get your draft in, okay? Notice I can't pass a paper that contains plagiarized portions. So that's another thing I will check for, and I'm going to show you a way that you can check as well in just a second. What I recommend students do, though, is to go back to every assignment that required some form of documentation, from the earliest assignments, you know, the comparison and contrast with research, the using documentation where you had to paraphrase and summarize, and paraphrase and directly quote, and find two sources online. And, you know, I marked up everything down to this definition, right? I marked everything. Go back and see what you missed if you missed something, okay? And make sure that you understand it. Remember that you can always schedule an appointment with me. There's that schedule an appointment feature is still available in our menu, and I will be glad to go over things with you if you need a bit more individualized instruction, okay? And again, with diction, we're trying to stay with, I realize there's some overlap here, but we're trying to avoid using you, avoid abbreviations, cliches, and so forth. Don't be too conversational or casual. And the question comes up frequently whether or not you should put yourself in this paper, this. My response would be no, with one exception. If for some reason you're an authority, all right, if for some reason you have some level of experience, you should not put yourself in the paper. As a matter of fact, it actually hurts the argument to some extent if you don't have the credentials to discuss it, because this is the paper that should rely on your research, okay? Again, the only exception is if you have direct experience and that somehow valid enough that it could be considered strong evidence to support what you're saying, or if you have the credentials to support your perspective, okay? Let your research do the talking. Okay, and of course, here's the schedule, process and schedule. First draft is due to the Turnitin Dropbox July 22nd. That's a week from this Thursday. I will have your feedback available by the next day. Okay, if after 4 o'clock that Friday, your feedback will be available, and you have until the following Tuesday, which is the last day of class, to upload the paper. If you're having trouble uploading papers, again, I realize we've again changed to another system, and Blackboard's a part of that system, and I think they're still working out the bugs. That's all I can figure, because students have never had this kind of problem uploading to Turnitin before. But if that is you, just go ahead and do what we've been doing, which is you email it to me and I upload it for you. I can't grade these types of papers outside of Turnitin, and I'll show you why in just a minute, or I won't. I mean, I could, but they help me on Turnitin helps me in a variety of ways to check a variety of things. So I will need to upload that. Please don't procrastinate. If you try and do this at the last minute, it's not gonna work for you successfully. I would break it up and do a little bit of research every day, unless you're just one of those people who likes to dive in and get it all done at one time. All right, we're going to pause there and see if you have any questions. And there are a couple of other things I want to talk about, and we'll be done. Any questions on any of this? Okay, if no, then I want to talk about your topics for just a second. Again, first thing, be sure and have a backup topic. Have something in mind that you can switch to that might be a bit easier if you have trouble finding research. There are a couple of your topics, your issue proposals, that was the comment I made. Be sure to have a backup topic, because I don't know whether or not research is going to exist or how easy it will be to find it on what you're suggesting you want to do. Maybe a great topic, I'm just not sure, and that just may be my limited experience with it, that you're going to have an easy time finding information. So have a backup, because you don't have time, a lot of time to waste. If you're having trouble coming up with topics, there is a great little resource, one of the databases called Facts on File. It's a GNTC database. You can access it in databases A to Z. Under F, Facts on File, and what it has, like its interface, its cover page, is basically all of these topics in all of these categories. And what Facts on File does is it presents both the pros and cons. It doesn't take a side, it just presents the pros and cons of different articles. In the video, in the research video, I actually address it and show you how to go about using it. So that's a great place if you just can't come up with another idea. That's a good place to maybe find another potential topic, because the issues they deal with in Facts on File are all debatable. Strong recommendation to be flexible. I don't know how much research you've ever done, but it can be very frustrating, especially the more rigid you are about what you want to know and what you want to find. It can be a very frustrating experience if you're not flexible enough to kind of go with what you find, or be willing to kind of alter your claim a little bit. Same topic, but just sort of a different point about it. Avoid oversimplification. Very few issues are either or, black or white, good or bad. Okay, don't oversimplify and reduce down. That's called an either-or fallacy. You actually do have a fallacy exercise that will be due, and fallacies are errors in logic, there are emotional and ethical fallacies, but largely when we think of fallacies, we think of errors in logic. And so to oversimplify something that's actually quite complicated is a fallacy. Okay, so avoid that. Also, don't be too abstract or too broad. If your topic is too broad, some topics people have written books about, and so what you need to do is narrow down and focus on some specific aspect, even though it may interest you to go beyond that. For the purposes of this assignment, you need to be very specific and find specific information. That's going to be a more effective paper than something that's very general, okay, and abstract. So if, again, we were in a class, what I would have you do is you're deciding your topic, and again, your topics have been approved, but I want to give you some food for thought here. There's a list of 12 tests. We're only going to look at, I think, about 8 of them, of an arguable issue. Number 1 has to do with, is it resolved? Is it already resolved or settled? You definitely don't want to argue something that they're you know, we're kind of beyond it now. All right. Number 2, is it debatable? A student submitted, I actually had more than one student who submitted issue proposals about human trafficking. That's not a debatable topic. I'm not sure that there are many people who would be in favor of human trafficking, right? But within that broad category, there are quite a few debatable issues. You know, for example, you can argue that the laws aren't stringent enough, or you can argue that there's not enough information available about where and how it's happening. You can argue that other countries have not taken enough of a stand, or actually even making it easier for people to be trafficked. So there are debatable issues within that broad topic. The topic itself is not debatable. Okay, so number 3, and this one is the toughest. Are you open to where the research leads you? Again, you've chosen a topic probably because you care about it, and those actually are the best things to write papers on, things that you care about, because that actually often translates, your interest translates to the audience and engages the audience as well. But the problem is, my favorite example is I have 2 students, 2 different semesters, both were writing about the legalization of marijuana, and this was a few years ago before it became increasingly legalized across the country. So this was before that had even started. And I had one student who initially, his whole thing was he was absolutely opposed to it until he did the research, and it totally changed his mind. And so he ended up writing the paper in favor of the legalization of marijuana for these uses and so forth. I mean, his claim was a bit more specific than that. And then I had a female student who was absolutely for the legalization of marijuana until she did the research. And then her research led her to argue that, no, it should remain illegal because of these reasons. And so, again, that's what we mean when we're saying, are you, because that's really honestly, you know, an honest researcher is somebody who really is interested enough to inform him or herself, and then take that information and do something with it. So, so just sort of be aware that's honestly how you should approach, you know, your topic. The third recommendation or question: are you interested and engaged enough? And again, I'm going to assume most of you care about what you've selected. There's a and that actually came out in your issue proposals. It's part of the reason I have students do it, because it kind of, not only I want to make sure that they're not using off-limits topics, I want to make sure that they're using debatable topics, but also it shows me their level of engagement in their proposed focus, and because those often make the best papers. This is kind of an odd one, and I don't know that it necessarily applies to anything that any of you have chosen. Is your topic safe for you? Especially more topics that are emotionally loaded. Occasionally I've had students who want to tackle something that has to do with some experience that they've had. And the problem is that often if you have not worked through whatever it was, if it's impacted you strongly, it's not necessarily a safe topic, because it's hard to be, you're not objective when you're writing. I'm not saying this is not an objective paper. As a matter of fact, this the biggest pitfall is students who turn an argument into an information paper, and they just present both sides of the information, and sometimes they don't even take a stand until the end of the very end. That's not structuring a paper as an argument. You definitely want to take a stand. You definitely want to argue a perspective. Often what you do is, though, you have what's called a qualified claim. And where part of the claim, your thesis is, while it may be true that blah, blah, blah has done a lot of good for blah, 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 comma, overall the impact has harmed more people that helped or something like that. That's called a qualified claim, because what you're doing is you're being sort of reasonably showing there's an aspect of this that's okay. However, taken in the whole, it's not effective. That avoids that whole either or oversimplification. I don't know how I went sideways there, but be careful that you don't end up just providing us with information. You've got to be arguing a point. But again, sometimes topics are not necessarily safe for people if they haven't worked through their own issues with the topic. And so the emotional impact can interfere, with the writing, but also be disturbing to them. And then, of course, you've got the issue of common ground, as I mentioned before. If you are going to use any type of ethical appeal, you've got to try and find common ground, sort of a generic common ground that most people would agree with, right? Otherwise, and again, look back at this section of this on ethos, otherwise you're not preaching to the choir, to use that cliche. So you've got to find a way to get somebody on your side. And finally, or at least have them remain open to what you want to argue. And then, finally, of course, and this is going to be one that you're not going to know until you dig into it, can you find adequate information? And my recommendation, since we have short time, is to switch topics if you can't. This is the last point. You need a clear and limited focus. Some of the topics that students wrote about in their issue proposals are pretty broad. You've got to narrow down to some specific aspect of that broad topic, or maybe a couple that kind of overlap or can be categorized together. Otherwise, the paper will remain too general. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about this? All right, last thing I want to show you, and I may have gone over this before. I don't know, but, or you may have been able to figure it out. This is how using, let me see if can find there it is. This is a paper, this is in Turnitin.com. It's a paper from, it should show up in just a second. All right, hopefully you can see this okay. We're about done. This is a paper from a previous semester, actually it's a totally different class, English 1010, but I wanted to show you the value of Turnitin in helping you double check your direct quotations. Again, you may already know this. I've referred some of you to this in the past. But here on the right hand side, I don't know that your screen looks like this because again I can't see the student view. This is the instructor view. But in red you'll find a number, and that is your similarity report. The match overview. If you select that, what it does is highlight all of the information that it finds in a paper that is typed word for word, same as either papers that it's found in its database or papers that are online. Okay? It's not plagiarism as long as it's handled correctly. And again, handled correctly means there are quotation marks around it and there's documentation. Now, this is not entirely correct because I recommend that students use a signal phrase for direct quotes, according to, or at the very least, an article states, an article from some journal states, and then you have your in-text citation. And the quotation mark should come at the end of the quotation, not after your parenthetical documentation, okay? But notice what it does is it highlights, it numbers them, it highlights anything that it finds that it matches to information online. Now, every once in a while, very rarely, it will match something that's a very common phrase. And that's just logic. I know you didn't copy, that information. But a couple of things, the way this is useful. Number one, notice this says 14% of this paper, it is matching for direct quotations, okay, or for information copied word for word. In your paper, no more than 20%, it should not be more than 20% should be directly quoted. Now, please hear me. I'm not saying get it down to 0, okay? Because direct quotations are important. They draw attention to themselves. They emphasize a point. If you're dealing with an authority, let the authority do the talking for you. So there are times to use them. You just don't want most of your paper to be directly quoted. Now, for the definition right, some of you had pretty high percentages. I didn't count off for that because I didn't have any guidelines about that. But for this paper, rely less heavily on direct quotations. No more than 20% of your paper, and that'll show up right here, should be directly quoted, okay? Paraphrase and summarize. You still have to document it, but paraphrase and summarize everything else. The second thing it does is it helps you check to make sure that you're putting quotation marks around and including in-text citations for the information that you need, that you actually pull from the source word for word. And the guideline is 5 or more words in the same order as the original should be placed in quotation marks. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. That's all I have for you. Does anybody have any questions for me? Okay, if not, if something comes up, you can always email me or schedule an appointment. I'll be glad to kind of talk with you through Blackboard, collaborate, and work with you on that. We're going to stop there.